Chapter 20 of The Seventh Most Important Thing by Shelley, Pearsall. Just to get out of the house, Arthur took a walk to Mr. Hampton's garage on the Saturday after Christmas. It was one of those deceptively sunny but frigid end-of-December days. Arthur's breath made clouds. The snow-covered sidewalks crunched like icebergs under his feet. He passed by an older guy who was walking a dog wearing a ridiculous sweater. Arthur normally didn't wave to people, but since it was just after Christmas and they were the only ones around, it seemed like the right thing to do. "My wife knitted it," the guy said, waving back. Arthur smiled politely and kept going. He wasn't sure what he hoped to find at the garage when he got there, or why he felt the need to go there at all during his 2 weeks off. It wasn't as if Officer Billy would deduct an hour from his probation for visiting the garage, but his curiosity about what Mr. Hampton was doing had gotten the better of him. Officer Billy had said the guy was going away for the Christmas holidays, but Arthur didn't believe it. A trash picker didn't seem like the kind of person who would take vacations or have a regular family somewhere. It seemed more likely he wanted to work at the garage without being bothered. Arthur figured if he stopped by unexpectedly, he might get a glimpse of what the guy was up to. The purpose of the 7 most important things still bugged him. He wanted to see what else he could find out. Of course, the walk turned out to be a complete waste of time. The garage was locked up and looked as deserted as always. The grocery cart sat in its usual place outside the garage door with its wheels buried in clumps of snow and ice. Maybe Officer Billy had been right. It didn't seem like anybody had been around the place in days. Groovy Jim's shop was dark and closed up too. There was a folding iron gate across the doorway, which made the place look a lot more unfriendly than it usually did. A handwritten sign behind the gate said, "Back next year." It took Arthur a minute to figure out the sign meant he'd be back in a few days when the new year arrived, not in 365 days. Since there was nobody around and nothing to see, he shoved his hands in his pockets and walked home, feeling like an idiot. A cold idiot. When Arthur returned home, he found Barbara sitting in the middle of the living room floor, munching on a sugar cookie. She was wearing her pink plaid coat and mittens. Crumbs were everywhere. "What are you doing?" he said. "Where's Mom?" "She went next door to borrow something. I was playing outside, then I got hungry, so I came in." Barbara chewed on her crumbly cookie. "Oh, and I talked to your friend, too." Arthur stopped pulling off his boots. He stood in the hallway with one boot on and one off. "What friend?" he said, because he didn't have any friends. Not since his dad's accident and being in juvie. Even before that, he hadn't had a lot of friends. He wasn't the kind of person who liked to hang out in big groups. His best friend, Ben Branson, who'd lived a few doors down the street, had moved away at the end of 5th grade. They used to play kickball together and trade baseball cards. He still had a couple of his Roger Maris cards. "Was Ben back here?" he said, glancing out the window. Despite being good friends, they'd never bothered to write much after he left. "No, your friend with the shopping cart. You know," Barbara said impatiently, glaring at her brother as if he were a dope. "The old man who you threw the thing at, but now you're friends with again? That's who." Arthur stared at his sister. What in the world was she talking about? The junkman? Mr. Hampton was here?" he said slowly. Barbara nodded and took another bite of her cookie. "Well, he didn't have that old cart with him, but I knew it was him when I saw him across the street, so I waved and said, 'Hi, mister,' and he came over and shook my hand and told me, 'Merry Christmas.'" Barbara stuck out her hands to demonstrate. "So I said, 'Merry Christmas,' too, and I told him how you were my brother and how you weren't bad anymore now." She smiled proudly. "And I said how you had promised not to throw anything else again. Wasn't that nice of me?" she added. Arthur couldn't believe what he was hearing. It seemed like way too bizarre a coincidence that he'd been trying to find out more about the junkman, and maybe, at the same time, the junkman had been trying to find out more about him. "Oh, and I also asked him if his kids got lots of stuff from Santa for Christmas, and he said he doesn't have any kids." "Isn't that sad?" Barbara gave an exaggerated frown. "But he said it was okay. He likes being by himself." Arthur shook his head. How could his little sister have found out more about the junkman in 5 minutes of blabbering than he had? "What else did he tell you?" Arthur pulled off his other boot. He pretended not to seem too interested in the conversation so his sister wouldn't clam up. "Well, he told me he doesn't live in our neighborhood. He lives in the 3 little rooms in a building farther away, and I asked him why he always pushes a shopping cart around, and he says it isn't a shopping cart, it's a chariot, but you just can't see the horses. Isn't that funny?" Barbara laughed. "A chariot, but you can't see the horses." "And the best part of all," she stood up and reached into her coat pocket, "he gave me a pretty silver bead to keep." She held out her hand. And there, in his sister's pink mitten, was the missing silver temperature knob from the toaster.